There's a big difference between sabotage and murder, and it could be that breaking things that are wrecking the biosphere is entirely appropriate, whereas it's never appropriate to hurt other humans. And so there's a kind of a sword of Damocles hanging over the nations who both signed the Paris Agreement and cannot afford to stop selling their fossil fuels. One of the hottest wet bulb temperatures ever recorded was just outside of Chicago. So it isn't just the tropics that are going to be hammered by this. This combination of heat and humidity can happen in many places at pretty much higher latitudes than you could imagine. Because if the grid goes down, there will still be little solar power fans, air conditioners, rooms everywhere that will be self-sufficient no matter what the grid does, so that the mass death that I described is less possible than it was in 2019, even though the temperatures have been rising.
Welcome to a special BMJ interview with author Kim Stanley Robinson. I'm Kamran Abbasi, Editor-in-Chief. The BMJ is introducing a new concept issue that will be published at the start of each year. We'll be publishing a series of solutions-focused articles on one important theme. This year, the theme is climate change. We were inspired by Kim Stanley Robinson's book, Ministry for the Future, which is a highly acclaimed work of science fiction published in 2020. Ministry for the Future describes the catastrophic events leading up to the creation of the ministry, and then goes on to tell us about how the ministry safeguards the planet for the benefit of future generations. It talks about the solutions, and the solutions cover every aspect of the climate emergency, global finance, nature, rising sea levels, extreme temperatures, energy production. The list is exhaustive. This fictional ministry's work starts in 2025. So we asked experts from a range of disciplines to write about one solution to the climate crisis from their area of expertise, which exactly mirrors the work of the ministry. Therefore, we're delighted and honoured to be joined by Kim Stanley Robinson to talk about his inspiration for his book, Why Action Creates Hope, and what medicine can do to make a difference. Welcome to Kim Stanley Robinson, acclaimed science fiction writer and author of the very, very popular book, The Ministry for the Future. Stan, welcome.
Thank you, Cameron. It's good to be with you.
Well, it's lovely to have you with us. It's a real honour for us. Can I begin? We're in 2025. Your book was published in 2020. I assume you started it much before then. But now we sit, and 2025 is also the year that the Ministry for the Future begins its work. How do you feel now? If you were to write the book now, how would you write it differently?
Well, I'm finding that it's holding up very well. In terms of still looking like a book that you could read now without saying, oh my gosh, this is also a historical novel, which really for science fiction, science fiction is indeed about the future, so it's always going to be wrong eventually, and especially once it gets past the date where it postulates its setting, then you can really see how wrong it is, and that makes it a historical novel. So that Ministry was written in 2019. You can see that. It's not aware of the pandemic or the Russians' invasion of Ukraine, but it is a kind of a disorderly and chaotic future that it describes. So it still seems pretty fitting, and I'm noticing that the violence, the political violence in Ministry for the Future, which people were quite shocked by it in 2020. And now when the book is newly read, nobody's shocked by it because worse things have happened in the 5 years since. And so in most ways, I think the book is still fresh and seems to be about a future that is happening to us now.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about that particular aspect of it since you've introduced it, because I've got a question here from one of our climate change advisory group, Howard Frumpkin, who's a emeritus professor from the University of Washington in Seattle. And his question that he forwarded to me to ask you was that a striking feature of the Ministry for the Future is the dirty tricks department. Do you think extraordinary measures, brash, forceful, unconventional, sometimes extra legal, are necessary in tackling the climate crisis? How do you reconcile the destructive destruction of key institutions as is now occurring in the US with the creative destruction that might be needed for a true system change?
This is a difficult question. When I wrote the book, I was thinking that many agencies that are working in the open light of day also have black wings that are doing things out of view of the public that can range from theater to sabotage to murder. And I wanted to explore that without being particularly comfortable with it. You can see that in the book.
Yeah.
So that the head of the Black Wing, Badim is an interesting character, but we don't know exactly what he has authorized. Things happen in the book that you could say, oh, that must be the ministry's Black Wing, or it could just be something done by completely independent actors. So I tried to shift the burden onto the reader in this sense. What would you authorize if you were in Badim's position? And then when he goes back to India near the end of the book and meets with a group of the children of Kali and tells them they need to stand down, that the war has been won, it's clear that he has indeed, he feels that his hands are bloody to the elbows. So you can infer that he has authorized some things he's not comfortable with. In the world today, I believe that you might be able to regard my Badim as a relatively upright character, like someone from a John le Carré novel, like George Smiley, uncomfortably doing hard things to, hopefully for the greater good. I was interested that Obama liked the Ministry for the Future, as he said at the end of that year when it came out, because he himself authorized extrajudicial killings when he was president. So he must know how it feels, and he must have thought that something was right in it. And I guess what I would also want to add is the really significant changes that I describe in Ministry for the Future do not come out of the violence. Those are almost treated as things that will happen, but are not crucial to a good outcome.
Yeah.
And I think that's true. And I think that often violence per se, political violence, a distinction also should be made. Andreas Malm is very good on this. There's a big difference between sabotage and murder. And it could be that breaking things that are wrecking the biosphere is entirely appropriate, whereas it's never appropriate to hurt other humans. If I had read Malm's book, How to Blow Up a Pipeline, before I wrote Ministry for the Future, I would have maybe added a chapter or two that made that distinction very, very clear.
Okay. You introduced the US and the political situation in the US. What interests me about the book is that the fact that the ministry itself is created through a consensus of governments, through a multilateral accord. However, thinking of today and the way the US operates, it seems quite difficult that we could get that kind of consensus.
Yeah, well, luckily I wrote the book in 2019 in a quick rush of about 6 to 9 months, but I wrote it during a Trump administration, so the book takes no belief in the idea that the US would be helpful in all of this. This brings up the Paris Agreement, because my ministry is just a standing committee, which the Paris Agreement allows itself, the Congress of the Parties, or the UNFCCC, to establish year-round committees if they needed it, and my ministry is simply one of those. So it's a function of the UN, and the United States is still in the UN, but a lot of the UN's operations runs by majority vote or by bureaucratic moves. This consensus where all the nations have to sign off on it, the Paris Agreement includes that, and it's presumably why several nations signed up for it, because they knew that they could block anything they didn't really want.
Yeah.
So now, as we see, it's been 10 years of meetings for the climate meetings of the Paris Agreement, and they're under an injunction from the Paris Agreement itself to up their game, to ratchet their promises, to make them more and more bold year by year. That gets very hard when you need every nation to agree, and at least 10 nations, perhaps more like 30, are what you could call petrostates. Yeah. Where when they reduce their fossil fuel sales, they begin to bankrupt their governments. And so there's a kind of a sword of Damocles hanging over the nations who both signed the Paris Agreement and cannot afford to stop selling their fossil fuels. We're in a conundrum that needs to be faced up to directly, and not by shenanigans of the black wing variety, but in the central plot of ministry is about the invention of a carbon coin, so-called, which you could just quickly, for people who haven't read the book, describe it as quantitative easing, like happened in 2008 and 2020, where several $1 trillion were made up from scratch, in effect, to save the economy, to save the biosphere. That could be done on a regular basis without destabilizing one's sense of money. We proved that in 2008 and in 2020. So carbon quantitative easing to make nations who legitimately stop selling and burning their fossil fuels, give them some compensation, and in general to pay for the green transition to clean energy and to, the health of the biosphere more generally, that we need to pay ourselves to do this work. And if that came from central banks as newly created money, along with legislation from the nation states, but if there was about $1 trillion a year of quantitatively eased new money from the big central banks, we could pay ourselves to do the necessary work.
Yeah. I think one of the attractions of the book is that the many initiatives that are explored and started in the book and that we learn about feel within grasp. They don't feel as if these are impossible. And the point about carbon coin, I mean, whenever I've read the book twice now, and on each occasion I felt, well, why couldn't we do this? And I just wondered whether you're aware of any conversations that have taken place around that concept, and whether they have gained any traction.
Well, there is a group I didn't know about when I wrote the book called the Network for Greening the Financial System. And you can look it up online. It is an official meeting place or study group of about 90 of the central banks, including all the big ones. And so these are theorists and economists working for the big central banks that get together to try to green the financial system, as their name suggests. And so what I'm thinking, like one of their white papers is 9 ways to green the financial system. My carbon coin is essentially a literary symbol for any number of financial instruments that are being discussed that could do this work. And I like my idea because it's so simple and straightforward. You can explain it in the novel, but there are much more complicated financial instruments that could do the same thing. And finance people definitely love their financial instruments because then also you can bet on them. You can play them as a game while still helping the world situation. So then also there are discussions at World Bank and at International Monetary Fund. These have been instruments of power, post-war American global power, but they still exist as structures that could do really good biosphere work, as well as dominating smaller countries if they wanted to.
Yeah.
So it's younger intellectuals and idealistic economists who have gotten jobs at World Bank and the other international agencies and the central banks, including the U.S. Federal Reserve. There are study groups. Now, you asked about traction, very important. I don't know. Certainly with the current U.S. administration, everybody else is keeping their heads down, trying to plan for when a saner administration takes over and we get back to the necessary work of coping with climate change.
Yeah.
So I would suppose that a lot of good projects are kind of hoping not to be noticed right now.
Yeah. I'm guessing that the current financial system that we have is one that wouldn't be open to the idea of a carbon coin. And if I could just refer back to a quote I found on actually Wikipedia, which is from Frederick Jameson, your doctoral supervisor, who wrote that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism. I'm sure you're very familiar with that quote.
Yes.
And your books do have a very, well, what I took away from them was a strong critique of capitalism.
Yes. Oh, yes. And I must say that my beloved teacher, Fred Jameson, who was really a crucial figure in my life and much missed by me, he always laughed at that. His actual sentence is a little more long and Jamesonian and modulated. And he claims that it was Slavoj Žižek, that Žižek sloganized it and is the real originator of that phrase. But I tell you, it's in Jameson in a slightly more complexified form. And I never agreed with him. It's perfectly easy to imagine the end of capitalism. This is what utopian literature does all the time. But I think what he meant, and indeed his sentence, which is maybe twice as long, is more suggestive of this, that we are incapable of imagining how to get there. So, okay, a better system, a better political economy, I could rattle off the elements of it to you. And anybody could immediately think of them too. But getting there from our current locked situation, this is what Jameson is pointing to, that our imagination of the process that gets us from here to there is incapable of figuring out ways that we could actually do it. This is one reason that my book, Ministry for the Future, is like 550 pages long, is that it describes that in some granular detail. And as a succession of small reforms in the right direction with also reversals included, and without a plan, nevertheless cludges forward into a better political economy. Well, we can do that. And so it comes back to politics, which is depressing, of course, but also accurate.
Yeah. It is a strong theme, but your book is really one for the polymath, because there is all the financial and economic side to it. There's a science side to it. There's the inequality side to it. That's particularly appealing to me at the BMJ. In fact, you had me at Gini coefficient. I've never seen a chapter about the Gini coefficient before. And then there's nature and, of course, all the other environmental aspects and the political aspects to it. Is it something, I mean, you have a history, I mean, your catalogue of immense science fiction writing does carry these ecological, environmental themes. Was this a book that you've been kind of brewing over all those years, or I mean, how did it come to you?
Well, it's for certain that all of the other books that I have written, especially since around, the last 35 years or so, they very often are utopian texts, and so they all were additive to Ministry in that I've always kept coming back to the same idea of a utopian future. But with Ministry, I decided, let's not go to Mars or to an alternative history or to Antarctica. In other words, to displace it in space and time. Let's put it here and now in this world, starting in 2025. And describing the next 30 years going as well as you can believe in. And so it's a best case scenario rather than a utopia. And that was my goal. And since it is the BMJ, I can say for sure that it was a bit of medical news in a journal like yours that shocked me and made me decide I've got to write this now. And this was the wet bulb 35 limitation on human survivability. It comes, as far as I can tell, out of medical research putting together disparate parts of the problem, because of course we've never really had a wet bulb 35 heat wave lasting for a month to see what it does to people. But just studying the parameters of human survivability in heat and humidity in combination, it was a medical report from about, I'm guessing, 2005 or maybe 2010. I ran into it about 2015. And at that point, I realized that my anger at the adaptationists had a point to it, there was a reason for it, because the adaptationists were saying, don't worry about climate change. We'll charge ahead. Humans are so adaptable. We can adapt to anything. We've done so in the past. We'll do it in the future. Why are you so worried about climate change? Why? Because it's fatal. It's fatal when you hit a combination of heat and humidity that they call wet bulb 35. And when I read that article, it was as if I had been spiked, like a needle in the eyeball. Time to write this up, that we can't just adapt to climate change. We have to mitigate. We have to cope. We have to make sure that we do not have the hottest futures that are likely to happen given what we're doing now. And so that was the inspiration for ministry. The primal cause, although I'd been doing books like it for 30 years, for this one, I wanted to show that it's necessary work. It's not optional. We have to cope with climate change. We have to decarbonize the atmosphere. We have to avoid turning, a third of the Earth's land surface into semi-uninhabitable land. One of the hottest wet bulb temperatures ever recorded was just outside of Chicago. So it isn't just the tropics that are going to be hammered by this. This combination of heat and humidity can happen in many places at pretty much higher latitudes than you could imagine.
Yeah.
So this was the origin of that.
Why was it that report that inspired you to base it in India, in UP, or was there some other, it's an obvious place in terms of population and the temperatures that are reached there.
Well, I was quite nervous about it. To put it in India was to displace it to the other side of the world, and those poor Indians, et cetera, et cetera. It was a dangerous move, but I felt like the back wall of the Himalayas makes UP and the rest of that region of the earth, South Asia, particularly susceptible to this danger. Yeah. And so the thing that I did, having decided to place the original catastrophe there, was to make sure that I foregrounded the Indian people and the Indian government in the solutions that follow, because they are driven at that point by overriding consideration and become leaders of world history at that point. This, I think, is quite possible as an eventuality in the real world. The world's biggest democracy, a synthetic culture, extremely volatile and chaotic, you might say, but also energetic and intense. So the novel sticks with India, I hope, in a way that the book has been read with great interest in India, as you can imagine.
Yes.
And I think with help from Indian friends, I got it right enough that I don't have to feel like I've exteriorized the problem.
No, you certainly did. I'm from South Asia originally. I'm from Pakistan, so I know the region very, very well. You certainly got it right. The one thing I think I was very interested to know you assiduously avoided, however, was much discussion about religion, because that, as you know, plays such a big part of life in India and across South Asia. I'm assuming that can only have been deliberate.
Well, yes. I want to add, before I answer that Pakistan, so they had that enormous flood a few years ago.
Yeah, in my part of the Pakistan as well, in the north. Yeah.
And the response was admirable, especially in the small-scale solar panel electrification of the country. And this has been, the panels have mostly come from China, just true everywhere, but the Pakistanis having installed so much solar power so fast, so that they have a little bit more personal and local control over energy, has been inspiration to anybody paying attention. And it's also very suggestive in that friends from the region, and mostly India, I have to admit, but Pakistan is also obviously involved, have said that the catastrophe that starts my novel is now less likely to happen, because if the grid goes down, there will still be little solar power fans, air conditioners, rooms everywhere that will be self-sufficient no matter what the grid does, so that the mass death that I described is less possible than it was in 2019, even though the temperatures have been rising. Now, as for religion, which is a good question, I postulated that the Hindu nationalists are currently ruling India in a way that's not good, not is a majoritarian overpressuring of a synthetic culture that has lots of minorities, that they are delegitimated by the catastrophe, and then a more syncretic and historically accurate and more wide-ranging government comes to being in India itself. Worldwide, we kind of need that to happen. And at the end of my novel, there is a call for a new religion, which is the oldest religion, which is a kind of a earth-centric religion of taking care of the fellow creatures. It's the necessary context for human life. The biosphere is our extended body. And once you see it as that, you can't wreck the biosphere without, in effect, like cutting off your legs. And that vision expressed spiritually as a kind of religious sensibility, something for devotion, something to worship. This is gestured at the end of my novel as almost a game or a cosplay. Let's pretend that we all believe in a Gaia religion and see if it comes true. And now what I'm noticing is that many people, they take that as the major strand out of my novel, as the important point. And so really the novel is a kind of a Rorschach blot. What do you think is most important? You find it in the novel and you think it's the most important part of the novel. Well, it's like you said, it's a polyphonic effort to try to cover all angles.
Stan, I'm going to pick up some questions from our advisory panel, if I may. This is Renee Salas. Renee is a clinician at Harvard. Her question to you is, the book highlights the pragmatic interdependence of stakeholders and the essential collaborative mandate at all levels. How would you see those lessons applying to the health sector?
So I think of medicine as the root of our invention of science and the scientific method, beginning with kind of trial and error, and going way back into the Paleolithic. It wasn't just Galileo, that moment of the Renaissance or the early modern period. The birth of science is Paleolithic in its origins, and always concerned with reducing human suffering in any way possible. So if that's extended to the biosphere, then you have a view that we are one living body, and humans are like bees in a hive. The hive has to be healthy, and the individual bee is quite a competent and intelligent creature, but needs the hive and all the rest of the bees to live at all. So that larger view of health as biosphere health is individual human health. That's the way that you could look at it to solve this problem.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the rationales that we use as medical journalists, is to say, by focusing on health, I mean, not in the broader sense that you just described there, as one kind of bioorganism, more that if people focused on the health outcomes, which is a rather stark way of doing that, we might start taking climate change more seriously. But unfortunately, that isn't working, and people hearing about a disaster in India or Africa or somewhere else, that doesn't seem to be working either. I mean, one thing that health professionals often think, and I think there's some grounds to think that it's valid, is that they do hold some sway. People do listen to them, and doctors, their patients take them seriously. Here's a question from Andy Haynes, who's a professor at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, just next door to us in London. How can the health arguments for climate action be amplified? What should health professionals be doing to advance climate actions?
Well, when the question itself brings up to my mind an organization that I admire very much, which is simply Doctors Without Borders.
Yeah.
And that name is so suggestive that there are higher value systems than the nation-state system, that the nation-state system is zero-sum game, competitive, and tribalistic in ways that aren't true to the fact that we're all one species on one planet, that the borders are arbitrary, historical, and unhelpful, that it's one people on one planet, but also all the other species. There's one community on one biosphere. So Doctors Without Borders can be the name for a philosophy. First, it's important to take care of each other, and doctors are the professionals of that we've managed to extend the power of by a civilizational effort that's been either 300 years or 15,000 years in the making, or 50,000 years, and that the borders are hurting us, and we need to be more interested in international collaborations of all kinds. So inspirational things come out of the theoretical work or the sociological work, the kind of pastoral work, and this is why I chose the word ministry for its multiple meanings, that the medical community is more than just taking care of illnesses. It's a name for a way of life or a philosophy of being.
I think that's very true, and it's something that we also support very much at the BMJ, that medicine is not just about what you do in the health service, what you do as a doctor with a patient, improving someone's health and well-being, and the planet's health and well-being is affected by by all the sectors, and doctors have a role in advocating for that broader work as well. But it's good to hear that's how you're thinking about it. And Doctors Without Borders, it's a very good organisation, but as a philosophy, I think that's a very, very interesting idea. Now, one of the the purpose of the Ministry for the Future is to safeguard the planet for future generations. And here's a question from Mala Rao, who's of Indian origin, but she's a professor at Imperial College in London. And her question is about young people. There are growing numbers of young people everywhere who are deeply concerned about their future and feel abandoned by the adults around them. How could their concerns be better heard?
Well, representation, which we're seeing more and more of course, their voices, when they gather them together into groups, but also as individuals, it's becoming more and more obvious that we need to listen to them, because they're the ones that are going to be alive in a damaged world. And they're going to be struggling with this their entire lives. We all are, to decarbonize the atmosphere and to get into a better relationship to the biosphere, a healthier relationship. I think that also things like the Children's Trust, when you get young enough, adult representation of these points of view, and just remembering that one's grandchildren are very quickly going to be our age and have grandchildren themselves, and that those people with equal rights stars are going to be in deep trouble depending on what we do or don't do, and that we have a responsibility to them. So this intergenerational thinking I see growing. I think it's getting stronger. And I'm speaking to college audiences that are literally a half century younger than I am. I could be their grandparent, the people I'm talking to. And I play a game with them. Let's think about this. When I was your age, I was listening to a guy my age talking to me about what it was like in Germany when you had to have a wheelbarrow of bills to buy a loaf of bread. And this was Herbert Marcuse. And I was listening to Herbert Marcuse, completely unaware of who he was. And he was talking about Germany in the 20s. I was a young guy, a young California guy in the 70s, somewhat incomprehending. Now I'm the 70-year-old. When I talk to 20-year-olds, they are, many of them, because of medical science, going to be alive in the year 2100. And we have some deadlines in terms of action to decarbonize this civilization that need to play out by the 2050s. So naturally, young people have anger, have climate dread, have the feeling that they can see the trajectories as well as anyone else. They can see the political battles and the kind of the frozen nature of the discussion, the way one tends to repress the climate for more supposedly immediate concerns. And they can read all that every day on their phones as a doom scroll, not necessarily by doom scrolling or looking for bad news. The bad news finds them. They can even try to dodge into trivial pursuits, and the bad news will chase them there too. They can't get away from it. And so this sense of dread, it's all very Freudian, and I know Freud is simplistic because it's a steam engine vision of the mind, but if you repress things long enough, they are still there and they burst back out in the return of the repressed. So it will be volatile, and that itself is scary. That what if you happen to be in a situation of relative stability, which not everybody is right now, but if you are in a situation of relative stability and you know for sure it's not going to last, then it doesn't feel secure. So there's a reason for, I hope that reason, that climate dread translates into political activism and into voting and into changing the system in every possible legal way, so that citizens regard part of their life as a citizen is to act on this stuff, rather than just retreat into a private repression and despair. And so we'll see what happens.
Yeah. I mean, that final point you just made is one that Howie Frumkin, who I mentioned earlier on our advisory board for climate change, he also makes that point. And I guess he might have got it from you, the point that being that hope comes through having some action, some belief that there are things that you can do that might make a difference. And I think it's fair to say that your book is a hopeful book. So a few critics have said it's perhaps overly hopeful.
That's true.
If that's possible, we need hope. You know, there are times like this we do need hope. But Howie wrote a piece for us about hope, and you know how it's important when it comes to climate action, exactly as you've described it there. So we've written quite a bit about this in the BMJ, and I wasn't surprised when he sent me in this question. I think we'll make it the final question. Stan, we're very grateful for the time you've spared us today. Where are you now on the spectrum of hope to despair? You can't say despair after what you've just said. And what gives you hope?
Well, one thing to say right away is that I've been worried about spreading hopium. This is a good neologism to describe a kind of faked optimism, or everything will be all right in some kind of Panglossian way. Yeah. We will forge through, people are smart, it will all be okay. This is what hopium attempts to describe. It needs to be emphasized. The situation is extremely dangerous, which is to say the burning of fossil fuels into the atmosphere and our general thrashing of the biosphere in ways that it cannot recover from in less than a few million years. It's a dangerous situation. So, okay, then how does hope reside? Well, again, with the BMJ, I can say hunger is a hope that you get more ATP. So hope is biological. Life is hope because life wants to live and therefore works at it. And so the cells hunt down and grab their ATP. The living creature hunts down and grabs its food. So hunger is a hope. Hope is a kind of a hunger for a better future or more security, or just to live on. And in more human philosophical terms, it's an existentialist point that humans need a project. So again, I was youngish in the 1980s, and there was no project except for capital accumulation. So I remember bumper stickers in the United States: the one who dies with the most toys wins. So this was sarcasm, but it also was pointing to the meaninglessness of capital accumulation as the only point of life. It's none of the many reasons to love the medical community is that there's better ways in this world to make money, but there's few better ways to do good. So having a project, this is very much my teacher Jameson and his teacher Sartre, having a project is a necessary part of human health and happiness. You have to have a project, which is simply a meaning. It gives your life meaning to have a project. Now, for young people, the project has been dropped on their heads like a ton of bricks. They have to cope with climate change, and it's frightening because we are in a very dangerous situation of sliding off into what they call hothouse Earth, where there is no ice on the planet. It's not like it turns into Venus. You don't boil the oceans away, but you do settle into a new steady state where there's no ice on the planet. Civilization would fail in that kind of crisis. We can't go that far. We have to deal. So, okay, that's their project. And described as such, it's both frightening and it's also energizing. It doesn't matter what field they're interested in. Young people, they can pick any possible field and it will still be relevant to coping with climate change.
Stan, thank you so very much for joining us today. Thank you for the gift of the Ministry for the Future. If I could just ask you, you're known for writing series. Will this become a series?
No. Please no. With that said, I want to write more fiction. I'm getting started this winter, and it's going to be climate fiction, inevitably, because that's our world, that's our future. And I like realistic science fiction. I'm not a fantasy writer. But I don't want to do sequels to Ministry for the Future. I kind of wrote myself into a corner there. It's not possible to continue in that vein. But I can pick pieces of the puzzle and maybe write little detective stories, etc. I have notions now, which I haven't had the time or the brain power these last 5 years to even have ideas. But now I've got some ideas, so I'll forge on.
Thank you. You can keep informed about latest developments on bmj.com. Thank you, and join us again next time.